The aroma of fried akra and warm pap filled the small one-room apartment, a simple haven for the widower David and his 6-year-old son Sam. The boy sat cross-legged on a wooden stool, his wide eyes following his father's every move. David, with his calloused hands and sunburned face, gently blew on the steaming pap before handing a small portion to Sam. "Eat, Sam," David said, his voice soft but firm. Sam grinned, revealing a missing tooth. "Papa, why is your pap always hotter than mine?" David chuckled. "Because I'm the one who made it, and it knows to be scared of me." Sam giggled, dipping a piece of akra into the bowl of pap and stuffing it into his mouth. David watched his son with a bittersweet smile. His wife had passed away 2 years ago, and every day since, he had poured his soul into making life better for his boy. "Papa," Sam began between bites, "when I grow up, I'll buy you a big house where the akra will make itself." David laughed heartily, his deep voice echoing in the cramped room. "And who will teach me how to eat fancy akra?" "I will," Sam said confidently, puffing out his little chest. After their breakfast, David quickly got Sam ready for school. The boy wore a faded green uniform that had been mended countless times, but still carried an air of dignity. "Do you have your books?" David asked, tying Sam's worn sneakers. "Yes, Papa," Sam replied, showing off his tattered notebook and stubby pencil. The walk to the government school was short, but filled with lively chatter. Sam pointed at every bird, cat, and car they passed, while David listened with a patience born of love. At the school gate, Sam hugged his father tightly. "Work hard, Papa," Sam said with a serious face. David ruffled his hair. "And you listen to your teacher. No running around like a wild goat, eh?" Sam laughed and ran off into the schoolyard, waving until he disappeared into the building. David arrived at the construction site, just as the foreman was barking orders. He had just his yellow helmet and joined the group of workers mixing cement. His body ached from years of labor, but he pushed through, motivated by the image of Sam's bright smile. During lunch, David sat on a concrete block, unwrapping a small bundle of boiled yam and pepper sauce. His friend James, a wiry man with a ready grin, joined him, munching on a loaf of bread. "David, you're too quiet," James said, breaking the silence. "You always come here, work, eat, and go home. No one knows much about you." David shrugged, chewing slowly. "What's there to know?" James squinted at him. "Plenty, my friend. Like, why don't you ever talk about your family? Or why you never join us when we go out after work? You can't carry everything on your own." David paused, his eyes fixed on the ground. "It's not that simple, James." "What's not simple?" "We all have problems, but keeping it inside won't solve anything," James said, leaning forward. David sighed. "You wouldn't understand. Try me," James pressed. For a moment, David considered brushing him off, but something in James' earnest gaze softened his resolve. "My wife, she died 2 years ago. It's just me and my boy now. Everything I do, every kobo I earn is for him. I don't have time for distractions." James nodded slowly. "I get it, David. That's heavy. But even strong men need a shoulder sometimes. You can't pour from an empty cup."
David looked at him, the weight of his struggles momentarily lifting. "Maybe you're right, but I'm not used to asking for help," James smiled. "Start small, like letting me buy you a cold drink after work." David chuckled, shaking his head. "You're relentless, James, and you're stubborn," James replied, grinning. For the first time in a long while, David felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, David returned to pick up Sam. The boy ran into his arms, laughing and recounting tales of his day. David listened, his heart lighter than it had been in years. And for a brief moment, as they walked home under the fading light, David thought that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The sun was setting behind the skeletal frame of the half-constructed building, casting long shadows across the site. David and James sat side by side on a low wall during their break, sipping sachets of cold water. The clamor of other workers faded into the background as James pressed David further. "You said earlier you're not used to asking for help," James began, folding his arms. "But now that you've told me a bit about your struggles, I think there's more to it. I see it in your eyes. What happened, David?" David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, He rubbed his hands together, half the rough skin rasping as he stared into the dusty ground. You want to know everything, James? Fine, but it's not a pretty story. I'm not here for pretty stories, James said, his voice steady. I'm here for the truth. David sighed, his voice heavy with a mix of regret and nostalgia. I wasn't always like this, you know. There was a time I had everything, a thriving supermarket, cars, connections, even a little bit of fame. People called me King David. I had staff who bowed when I entered the room and friends who laughed at my jokes, no matter how bad they were. James raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. King David, huh? Sounds like you had the world at your feet. I did, David said, his tone tinged with bitterness. But I was reckless, James. I didn't just live, I burned through life. Drugs, women, parties, you name it. I thought I was invincible. Then one day everything changed. James leaned closer. What happened? David's gaze softened as he smiled faintly, lost in memory. It was a rainy afternoon, and I was at this small cafe near my supermarket. I wasn't there for the coffee, of course. I was meeting someone to close a deal. But then I saw her. Her? James prompted. Jasmine, David said, the name rolling off his tongue like a prayer. She was beautiful, James, the kind of beauty that makes you forget your own name. She was standing by her car, trying to shield herself from the rain with a tiny umbrella. I don't know what came over me, but I offered her a ride. James chuckled. Classic move. David shook his head. It wasn't a move. At least that's what I told myself. She hesitated, but eventually accepted. We got to talking, and I found out she worked as a fashion designer. She had this grace about her, like she belonged to a different world. We exchanged numbers, and before I knew it, we were meeting regularly. James nodded. His interest piqued. So you fell hard? Hard and fast, David admitted. I spent on her like there was no tomorrow. Fancy dinners, designer clothes, vacations, you name it. She became my world. Our wedding was the talk of the town. People said we looked like a royal couple. James whistled low. Sounds like a dream. It was, David said, his voice darkening. Until it wasn't. A year into the marriage, she told me she was pregnant with Sam. I was overjoyed, James. I thought this was the start of a new chapter. But Jasmine, she changed. James frowned. How do you mean? She started using the pregnancy as leverage, David explained. She'd demand money for the baby, for herself, for things I didn't even understand, and I gave it to her. Every time, without question. Before I knew it, I was drowning in debts and loans. My supermarket suffered, but I couldn't see it. I was blinded by my love for her, or maybe by my fear of losing her. James rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And she kept taking? David nodded, his expression grim. To the point where I had nothing left. I lost the supermarket, the cars, the house. Jasmine didn't care. She stayed until the day she gave birth to Sam. Then she left. Left? James repeated, incredulous. Left, David confirmed, his voice heavy. She left Sam at the hospital and disappeared. The next thing I knew, I got a call saying she'd been in an accident. Her car had caught fire, and they said her body was burned beyond recognition. James's jaw tightened. You didn't see her body? David shook his head. There was nothing to see. We held the burial without her, but sometimes I wonder if she really died or if she just found a way to escape. James sat back, his mind racing. That's a lot, David. You've been through hell. David shrugged, his eyes distant. I survived. For Sam. He's all I have now. Everything I do is for him. James placed a hand on David's shoulder. You're stronger than you think, my friend. And you're not alone anymore. You've got me. We'll figure things out together. David offered a small, grateful smile. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a faint light piercing through the shadows of his past. The market buzzed with life that morning, the air filled with the scent of spices, fresh produce, and fried snacks. Vendors shouted over one another to attract customers, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. David navigated the narrow aisles, his woven basket slung over his arm, mentally calculating his purchases for the week. Tomatoes, onions, pepper, he muttered under his breath, scanning the stalls. He stopped at a vegetable seller, a middle-aged woman with a gap-toothed smile, and began picking out ripe tomatoes. How much for this bowl, Mama Esther? 800 naira, my son, she replied, adjusting her scarf. David winced. Ah, Mama Esther, reduce it nah. Let me give you 600. She laughed, shaking her head. David, you like to bargain too much. Okay, 700. Just as David reached for his wallet, A familiar sound caught his ear, soft laughter, light and melodious. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, but it struck him like lightning. He froze, the laughter weaving its way into his chest, squeezing his heart. Slowly, he turned his head toward the source. There, a few stalls away, stood Jasmine. She looked just as he remembered, radiant, elegant, and effortlessly captivating. She wore a flowing yellow dress that seemed to glow under the morning sun. In her arms, she cradled a baby, no older than a year, giggling as she playfully tickled its tiny feet. Beside her stood a tall man with a confident posture, laughing along with her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. David's heart thundered in his chest. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he was dreaming. But the scene before him was painfully real. Tears welled up in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks as he dropped the basket and approached her. "Jasmine," he called, his voice trembling. She stiffened at the sound of his voice, her laughter dying instantly. When she turned to face him, her expression morphed into one of shock and fear. "Jasmine, it's you," David said, his voice breaking. "You're alive. After everything, you're alive." The man beside her frowned, looking from David to Jasmine. "Who is this?" Jasmine clutched the baby closer, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "I don't know him," she said quickly, her voice shaky. David's hands balled into fists at his sides. "You don't know me?" he said, his voice rising. "After everything we went through, Jasmine, after you destroyed my life and left me with nothing?" People around them began to take notice, pausing in their shopping to watch the unfolding drama. Jasmine stepped back, her face pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Turning to the man beside her, she added, "He's mad. A madman from the streets." David's breath caught in his throat. "Mad? Jasmine, it's me, David, your husband, the man you married, the father of your child." The man stepped in front of Jasmine, his face hardening. "I think you've made a mistake," he said firmly. "Leave us alone." David shook his head, his tears falling freely now. "Mistake? She's my wife. That's my son she's holding." Jasmine's eyes widened, and she took another step back, shaking her head. "I've never seen you before in my life," she said, her voice trembling. "Let's go," she said to the man, tugging on his arm. The man hesitated, but Jasmine's urgency spurred him into motion. Together they hurried away, disappearing into the crowd before David could move. David stood frozen, his heart shattered into pieces. The whispers of the market-goers buzzed around him like a swarm of bees. "Isn't that David, the widower?" one woman murmured. "I heard his wife died in an accident," another said. David clenched his fists, ignoring the stares and whispers. He wiped his tears roughly and turned back to the vegetable stall, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. "David, are you okay?" Mama Esther asked softly, her brow furrowed with concern. He forced a weak smile, like though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Mama Esther. Let's just finish the transaction." But even as he handed over the money and picked up his basket, the image of Jasmine laughing with that man and the baby burned in his mind. The ghosts of his past were no longer content to haunt him from afar. They had returned, alive and breathing, to rip open old wounds. The night was eerily quiet, but David's mind was anything but still. He lay on the thin mattress in the small, dimly lit room he shared with Sam, staring at the cracked ceiling. The rhythmic hum of crickets outside was the only sound accompanying his swirling thoughts. He replayed the events at the market over and over, Jasmine's denial cutting deeper each time. Her terrified eyes, her hurried departure, the man by her side, all of it felt like a cruel dream, but the pain in his chest told him it was real. "Why, Jasmine?" he whispered to himself, his voice cracking in the stillness. "Why did you lie? Why did you take everything and leave me to pick up the pieces?" Beside him, Sam stirred in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent. David turned to look at his son, his small face peaceful in the glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. "I have to do better," David muttered, his resolve hardening. "For you, Sam, you deserve more than this." That night, as sleep eluded him, David made a promise to himself. He would stop living in the shadows of his past. He would rebuild his life. Not for Jasmine, not for anyone else, but for himself and his son. The following week, David began to put his plan into action. He cleared the small patch of land in front of his house, sweeping away the dust and debris. With the little savings he had left and a loan from James, he built a modest kiosk using wood and metal sheets. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He stocked it with basic provisions: sachets of milk, sugar, noodles, soft drinks, and snacks. At first, the business was slow. Passers-by would glance at the kiosk but rarely stop. David didn't let it discourage him. He stood outside with a warm smile, greeting everyone who walked by. Slowly, the customers began to trickle in. "David, you're really doing something good here," James said one afternoon as he bought a packet of biscuits. David chuckled. "I have to, James. No one's going to hand me a better life. I have to build it with my own hands." By the third week, the kiosk had become a small hub in the neighborhood. Children came to buy sweets after school, mothers stopped by for quick groceries, and men gathered in the evenings to chat over cold drinks. One day, as David arranged some new stock on the shelves, a soft, lilting voice called out, "Excuse me." David turned to see a strikingly beautiful woman standing outside the kiosk. She was tall, with deep brown skin that glowed in the afternoon sun. Her hair was styled in natural curls, and her eyes were warm and inviting. She wore a simple yet elegant dress that hinted at her effortless grace. "Good afternoon," David said, stepping forward with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" The woman returned his smile. "Good afternoon. I just moved into the neighborhood, and someone recommended your kiosk. I thought I'd come and check it out." David gestured to the shelves behind him. "Welcome. We have a bit of everything: milk, bread, snacks, drinks. If there's anything you don't see, just let me know, and I'll try to get it for you." She laughed softly, a sound that reminded David of Jasmine's laugh, though it lacked the sharp edge that haunted him. "Thank you. I appreciate that. By the way, I'm Maya." "David," he replied, offering his hand. She shook it firmly. "Nice to meet you, David. This is a lovely setup you have here." David glanced around at the humble kiosk, feeling a flicker of pride. "Thank you. It's not much, but it's honest work." Maya nodded. "Honest work is the best kind. I admire people who take the initiative to build something for themselves. I moved to Nigeria to do something similar, to support less privileged communities." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Really? That's impressive. What kind of work do you do?" "I'm starting a nonprofit," Maya explained. "We're focusing on education and skill development for young people in underserved areas. It's a big dream, but I'm determined to make it work." "That's admirable," David said sincerely. "The world needs more people like you." Maya smiled, her eyes shining. "Thank you. And it seems like the world needs more people like you too, David. You've created something valuable here, and it's clear that the community appreciates it." David felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, someone saw him, not as a broken man or a shadow of his former self, but as someone who was trying, someone who mattered. As Maya selected a few items and paid, she said, "I'll definitely be back. Keep up the good work, David." He watched her walk away, a faint smile on his lips. For the first time since the market encounter with Jasmine, David felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the future held something brighter for him and Sam, and this time he was ready to embrace it. The months that followed Maya's first visit to the kiosk were transformative for David and Sam. Maya became a regular fixture in their lives, stopping by the shop almost daily. Each visit brought more light into David's world. "Good afternoon, David," she would greet him warmly, carrying a bag of groceries or treats for Sam. "Afternoon, Maya," he would reply, his heart swelling with gratitude. Sam adored her. She would kneel to his level, ruffle his hair, and hand him a chocolate bar or an ice cream cone. "You're my little helper, Sam," she'd say, her voice playful. Sam would giggle and follow her around, beaming with delight. "Maya is so much fun, Daddy," Sam said one evening as he licked an ice cream cone. "She's like a princess," David chuckled, his heart full. "She is, Sam. She really is." It wasn't just Sam who was enchanted by Maya. David found himself looking forward to her visits, not just for her kindness, but for the way she made him feel seen and valued. Maya would often stay to help around the kiosk, chatting with customers or cooking meals for David and Sam after closing time. "You don't have to do all this, Maya," David said one evening as he watched her stir a pot of stew on the small kerosene stove in his kitchen. She glanced over her shoulder, smiling. "I know I don't have to. I want to." Her words and actions chipped away at the walls David had built around his heart. Over time, those walls crumbled and he let her in. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, David knelt before Maya outside the kiosk. Sam stood beside him, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Maya," David began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You came into my life when I had nothing but broken pieces to offer. You didn't just see me, you saw the man I could be. You've been my light, my hope, and my second chance. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Yes, David, 1,000,000 times yes." Their wedding was small but beautiful, attended by neighbors and friends. James stood as David's best man, grinning from ear to ear. Sam, dressed in a miniature suit, was the happiest of all, proudly announcing to everyone, "Maya is my new mommy." The three of them became a family, and their lives flourished. The kiosk expanded into a small store, thanks to Maya's business acumen and connections. Together, they built a life filled with love, laughter, and hope. One evening, as they attended to customers at the shop, an unexpected figure appeared at the doorway. David froze as he recognized Jasmine. She was a shadow of the woman he once knew, her once glamorous appearance replaced with disheveled clothes and a weary face. Tears streaked her cheeks as she approached. "David," she began, her voice trembling. "Please, I need your help." David stepped out from behind the counter, his expression neutral. "Jasmine, what are you doing here?" She dropped to her knees, sobbing. "The man I left with, he used me and threw me out when he realized I was draining him of his money. I have nothing left, David. Please, take me back, for Sam's sake." Before David could respond, Maya emerged from the back of the store, carrying a tray of freshly baked bread. Her presence was like a beam of sunlight, and Jasmine's eyes widened in shock. "This is Maya," David said, his voice firm. "My wife. She's the woman who helped rebuild the life you destroyed." Jasmine's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had lost everything, including the man who had once loved her unconditionally. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was selfish, and I didn't see what I had until it was gone." David nodded, his expression softening but remaining resolute. "I forgave you a long time ago, Jasmine, but forgiveness doesn't mean going back to what broke me. I've moved on and I'm happy now. I wish you peace, but there's nothing for you here anymore." Jasmine rose slowly, her tears falling freely. She cast one last glance at Maya, who stood tall and unbothered, her hand resting gently on David's shoulder. Without another word, Jasmine turned and walked away, her sobs echoing into the night. As the door closed behind her, Maya turned to David and smiled. "Are you okay?" David nodded, pulling her and Sam into a tight embrace. "I am now. I've finally closed that chapter for good." The three of them stood together, a picture of resilience and love, ready to face whatever the future held. The end. Please subscribe and like to support us.